Who killed these girls? It's a question that's plagued Austin, Texas and the true crime community for over 30 years. But after 50 confessions, 2 overturned convictions, and a suspect killed by police, people are starting to wonder if we'll really ever know who committed the Austin yogurt shop murders. In researching the case, I was actually able to sit down with a juror who convicted one of the suspects. We'll get some insight into the first investigation, the cold case investigation of the late 90s, and the renewed interest to find the perpetrator or perpetrators. Friday, December 6th, 1991 became known as the day Austin lost its innocence. An officer was on patrol around midnight of a small shopping mall in Austin, Texas off of West Palmer Lane. While on patrol, the officer noticed flames billowing out of the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop. He called firefighters and first responders, who arrived on scene quickly and used torrents of water to put out the blaze, having no way to possibly know that they might have destroyed vital evidence that would keep this case open for 30 years. It was after closing time for all the businesses in the shopping center, so they would have little reason to think there was anyone inside. However, as the fire was put out, investigators found 3 bodies stacked on each other at the back of the shop. A few feet away, they found a 4th body. And just as the scene started to calm down, it was converted to an active crime scene. Austin Police Detective John Jones was immediately put in charge of the case, and they got to work. To save you days of their investigation, here's what they figured out. Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas, who were both 17, worked at the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop. Sarah Harbison, Jennifer's sister, and her friend Amy Ayers had been hanging out at the local mall when they decided to join Sarah's sister at the shop. They were driven from the local mall over to the yogurt shop at around 10 p.m. At this point, there were several witnesses who were inside the yogurt shop in the hours before it closed. One of the most crucial things said by all the witnesses were that there were 2 men located at the table closest to the counter. Accounts of the 2 men varied. Some say they looked like they were out of place, while others say they looked completely comfortable, some even speculating that they were having a casual chat with the girls while they worked. It was said that they kept their hoods up on their sweatshirts the entire time they were seen by witnesses. Notably, the 2 men only ordered drinks while in the store, despite it being a yogurt shop. Witnesses say that one of the men left for several minutes and went to the bathroom. There are some theories that he used this time to potentially jam the back door of the shop, but that has not been confirmed. The last witness to leave the shop that police spoke to said that the 2 men were at the table just as they were leaving, which meant the store was now closed. So one of the girls followed them to the door and locked it behind them to prevent new customers from coming inside after closing hours. Now, there are many theories about what happened next, but generally, it is believed that at least 2 men, but possibly as many as 4, pulled out 2 guns, a .22 and a .38, and forced the girls to the back of the store. At least one of the girls was then assaulted by the suspects. The girls were then bound, gagged, and shot in the back of the head, and then presumably stacked on top of each other while the perpetrators began pulling out all the paper products and coating them as well as the girls in lighter fluid before setting the building ablaze. There is some speculation around the death of one of the younger girls, Amy. The bullet to the head did not actually kill her, and remember that her body was found away from the others. It's believed that she actually survived the initial attack and began to crawl away towards the front door of the store. She was then captured and choked to death by one of the attackers with a cloth around her neck. All of the items used to bind and gag the girls came from the store or from their own clothing. After one of the attackers choked her to death, they were able to exit the store before the officer on patrol wound up on the scene. The fire had actually been so intense that it melted the top rungs of a heavy aluminum ladder that was located in the store. So this was a gigantic fire, and it really calls into question how much time they reasonably could have hung around. Also, with regards to Amy's body, the 3 girls in the back had been completely charred beyond recognition. It was said by one of the officers they could not even tell the race of the 3 girls in the back. However, Amy had 2nd-degree burns on about 20 to 30% of her body that were just beginning to turn to 3rd-degree burns, suggesting she had been away from the others for some time. Detective John Jones tried to lock down the scene the best he could, and that's where they uncovered a lot of the facts that I just went over with you. 3 days after the murders, he announced that they were almost positive that there was more than one person that committed this crime. One of the likely reasons being the 2 guns, and the implied impracticality of one person being able to commit all this, though we'll talk about that theory later. There was money still left in the register, so it called into question the motive. So this either seemed to be a targeted killing or a crime of opportunity. However, this didn't seem to be a normal robbery, like was initially thought. Within just a few days, the first set of confessions came in. A young couple had confessed to the crime, though it was later proven to be false by the investigators. There isn't a lot of information about this first confession, only that it seems like the 2 were lying to stay out of trouble, something else they might have been doing. Which doesn't make a lot of sense, but we'll cover false confessions later and why they happen. About a week after the killing, officers found a teenager named Maurice Pierce wandering around the nearby North Cross Mall, the place where the 2 younger victims were before the yogurt shop murders occurred. Pierce was found with a .22, the same kind of gun that had been used in the killing. Upon being interviewed, Pierce said that the gun had actually been used in the crime and was used by his friend, Forrest Wellborn, and that Forrest had killed the girls inside the yogurt shop. Pierce would then go on to implicate Forrest and 2 other teenagers in the crime. Michael Scott, and Robert Springsteen. Investigators would conduct interviews with all 4 boys and would end up actually clearing all of them. It was their belief that Pierce had made up the confession in order to avoid the gun charge. So all investigation into these boys was stopped for the time being, but you might want to keep them in mind. Then the case basically goes stagnant for 7 years. Well, I say stagnant, a ton of confessions would come in, but all of them would end up being proven false. Either they'd been coerced, or they'd been someone fantasizing about being a part of the crime. The investigation would just be kind of dead for the next 7 years. One Mexican national did admit to being involved, but then later recanted, saying that he was being tortured by Mexican federales, and he had actually recanted many confessions that he had given. A lot of the sources also indicate that the FBI raided the Austin Police Department during this 7-year period, and one thing that was being investigated was their method of getting confessions out of people. This was a very quickly evolving time for a lot of investigators across the country of the 90s as more technology came in and cameras became more prevalent, and it was really a time of reform in police interrogation tactics. During this 7-year gap, APD goes through leads that point to over 700 individual suspects. They make their way slowly through all of them, but really just don't find anything. That's up until August of 1999. The Austin Police Department created a new cold case task force with one of their chief directives being to solve the yogurt shop murders. In less than a few months, really as early as October, they had their sights set back on the same 4 boys that we had talked about earlier. So each of the 4 boys were actually brought in and interrogated. The most important one that we'll talk about is the interrogation of Michael Scott that lasted about 20 hours, which included a grueling 12-hour stint in a little room in the APD headquarters. During this investigation, Michael Scott would confess to the quadruple homicide. Of course, this would come immediately after the officer put the gun to the back of his head in a dramatization of the event.
We want the truth, and you know what the truth is. You're having trouble with the memories or flashbacks. You know what happened. You're scared to tell us. I don't blame you. It's a horrible thing what you saw in there.
Look, can I tell y'all what I keep seeing in my head?
Tell us what you see in your head.
I keep seeing these girls get shot.
Right. Tell us what that looks like. Tell us what you see specifically. How they're getting shot and who's shooting them. Come on, Mike, we're doing good. Tell us. Let's do this today. Let's do it.
Seeing girls, I remember seeing them down. I remember one girl screaming, terrified.
Okay.
I don't know if this is real or not, or if this is...
Michael, it's real. It's okay. You can present it to us any way you want, but it's real. Mike, look at me. You're remembering what happened because you were inside there, right? You're remembering what happened.
I don't honestly remember going in the building.
But you were in the building. You went in there with them. I don't believe that, Michael. You do remember going in there. And you know you were in there. Did you shoot any of those girls?
No, sir.
Then tell us what happened. What did those 2 boys do to those girls? You want to live with this the rest of your life?
No, I don't.
Then get it out right now. They're you over. Them. They're the ones that shot the girls. Do it. What did you see happen?
At some point where he's handed that revolver, what does he say to you?
Either shoot him or you're next.
That's what he said.
Because I didn't want to do it.
Right. Either shoot him or you're next. What do you remember hearing then?
I remember looking at this girl. I cry. I hear Robert saying, "Do it, do it." I hear the gun go off. I only pulled the trigger once. I turn around. Here's your stupid gun.
What happened next, Mike? That brought back some memories, didn't it?
I remember looking at the gun.
You ever seen that gun before?
I'm not positive.
Does that look like a gun you've seen before?
It looks like a gun I've seen before, but I'm not positive.
Is that the gun you shot somebody with, Mike?
I don't.
Is that the gun you walked up behind somebody with and shot in the head? Is that the one? Talk to me, Mike.
Yes,
You did that, didn't you?
yes, sir.
We've just opened some more doors, haven't we, Mike?
Police would also secure a confession from Robert Springsteen. Then, on October 6th, 1999, Austin police would arrest Forrest Wellborn, Maurice Pierce, Robert Burns Springsteen IV, and Michael Scott on capital murder charges. Before the end of that year, a judge ruled that both Pierce and Wellborn, who were 16 and 15 respectively at the time of the killings, could be tried as adults. A Travis County grand jury then indicted Springsteen on 4 counts of capital murder, and the Travis County DA, Ronnie Earl, announced that he would seek the death penalty. More indictments would come later as a grand jury indicted Pierce and Scott each on 4 counts of capital murder. It was announced that the prosecution would be seeking the death penalty against Scott, but not against Pierce because he was a juvenile at the time of the crime. However, between December and June of 2000, the Wellborn case had actually been brought in front of 2 separate grand juries who declined to indict him. So a judge ended up dismissing the capital murder charges against Wellborn. With 3 people in custody, the first trial would soon begin. And the prosecution would be going into these trials with no physical evidence, armed only with the confessions. So let's take a moment to talk about false confessions. Both on the prosecution and the defense side, I've seen a lot of false confessions. And they happen for a ton of reasons that might not seem completely obvious, and some of them will seem completely obvious. So the one to get out of the way is that, yeah, a lot of people just want to be involved with the crime. They want to attach their name to history. A lot of times you'll see this with a very famous victim. You'll have a lot of people come forward and say that they were the ones who did it. Part of this is that they know that they will never actually be implicated in the crime because there's no direct evidence of them doing it because they didn't, and they just want their name attached to that person for the rest of history. One of the more prevalent reasons for false confessions is coercion. Police will slowly work down a suspect over hours in some of these interrogations if their rights aren't invoked. This used to be a huge problem where officers would keep people in uncomfortable rooms, in uncomfortable positions for sometimes days at a time while different officers hammered away at them. You hit a certain point where psychologically you just want to escape the room, and you start saying anything you can to escape the room. And the way officers would do things is they would slowly get you to admit one piece of seemingly not incriminating information. This would then snowball into more and more incriminating information by just you admitting, yes, I might have been at that place on the night of the murders, eventually cascades into you being the one who pulled the trigger. Their whole job during these investigations is to make it seem like if you just give them one more answer, then they'll let you go. Fatigue can also play a huge role. People get so exhausted that they just admit to whatever will get them out of the room. There's also obviously false confessions to implicate others that you may want to hurt or bring down. Completely invalid confessions come from torture methods usually, where physical or psychological pain is inflicted on the suspect until they admit whatever the officers want them to admit. Torture has been seen time and time again as a terrible interrogation tactic. After a certain level of pain, they'll admit to really anything. You'll see they eventually will start asking the officers what they want them to say in these kinds of situations, and they just agree to whatever they hear. Also, mental capacity can be a big deal here, and that's whether the person understands the situation that they're in or the consequences they're in. You'll see this a lot of times with children or even teenagers and people with mental disabilities. They don't understand the implications of what they're saying or draw out the consequences of making one small admission, which is followed by many more small admissions. Depending on the suspect's cognitive level, they can usually be tricked very easily. There's one famous story of a police officer who had an older gentleman in a room interrogating him for a murder, and he wanted to actually get the guy to admit that his truck was at the murder scene. So to do this, he had taken a ladder and a similar truck to the suspect's and parked it at the murder scene, and then climbed up high on a ladder, took a picture, and claimed that he had satellite evidence of his truck being at the murder scene. So he explained satellite technology, gave this to the suspect, and the suspect begrudgingly admitted, I guess that must be my truck, so I must have been there at the time. He would later go on to be convicted, and his conviction would be overturned. It goes to highlight that 1, yes, police can lie to you, and 2, people will falsely confess to things that they know they did not do. And it's really easy to sit in the comfort of our own homes, in the air conditioning, sipping a coffee, and saying that we would never admit to a crime we didn't commit. Most of these people would have said the same thing. When you're in the moment after 12 hours and the police are grilling you and you just want to leave, at a certain point, you give up everything. Officers and investigators nowadays will try to take a lot of steps to avoid a confession being seen as coercion. But you have to be really careful with people under the age of 18, because a lot of times mental capacity can play a huge role in whether or not a confession is real or not. As silly as it sounds, a lot of teenagers may find it fun to confess to a crime. The point of all this is to say that false confessions do happen, and they happen for a lot of reasons. Sometimes they're intentional, most times they're the result of extreme psychological manipulation and exhaustion on the suspect. Now, that in and of itself doesn't mean a confession is invalid. A lot of the times the reason a person does truly confess is because of this psychological wear down, which is why people haven't wanted to put too many restraints on the police in these interrogations, such as allowing them to lie and to hold them them until they ask for an attorney. But it does mean that false confessions will be elicited. The big determining factor is what evidence can be applied. This is why good interrogators will hold back a lot of information. And during this process of applying psychological pressure, will get the suspect to admit to things that would only be known by the suspect. You don't want someone just guessing at a murder weapon, for example, saying, I killed them with a gun, or a knife, or I choked them, because then it seems like they're just guessing. You want to get the suspect to admit one small true admission and then follow that true admission to its logical conclusion, which means that the key difference between a false confession and having a good confession is making sure the evidence can be linked. Think about what we just saw in that Michael Scott interrogation video. We know he had been in there for 12 hours. We know he's exhausted. We know the police are really leaning on him. What we don't know is whether or not he committed this crime, partially because of the evidence that was accidentally destroyed by the firefighters. So we would hope that they would get Michael Scott or one of the other boys to tell them something they didn't know about the crime. However, the small snippets we ended up seeing made it seem like there was a lot of general psychological pressure being put on Michael Scott. Most notably, the officer walking up behind him and pressing the gun to the back of his head. Is it reasonable for Michael Scott to think that the officer was going to pull the trigger? No. But I believe anyone could imagine the natural fear that would come from having a gun pressed to the back of your head, whether the person intends to hurt you or not. Especially when you're cold, tired, hungry, and just want to get out of a situation. That's why this confession is not a great confession for the prosecution. And I can tell you, the thing I hate the most is bad confessions. I don't want a confession unless they come by it the right way. I dealt with a lot of confessions on the defense side that would be recorded by the alleged victim, but some of these confessions were come about by beating or threatening the defendant on the same audio recording. In one recording, I heard one of my clients being viciously beaten by the brother of one of the victims until he confessed. A prosecutor does not want these kinds of confessions. It looks bad and it's not compelling to juries. Because as much as I gave you a small rundown of false confessions, a good defense attorney is going to spend a lot of time during jury selection and during the trial itself explaining how false confessions come about. So all in all, this was not a great interrogation by the Austin Police Department, and I doubt the prosecutors were thrilled in how it was received. Nonetheless, they did decide to move forward with 2 trials. Springsteen's trial was up first in April 2001. As I said, the prosecution was armed only with the confession and no other physical evidence. What are the logistics of bringing only a confession into trial? Not great. As I said before, you really want to tie it to some physical evidence that you have. The prosecution read out Michael Scott's written confession, and it would serve as the key piece of evidence against Springsteen. It would turn out to be enough to convince the jury, and the jury would find him guilty. By June, Springsteen was sentenced to death for the murder of Amy Ayers. A year later, the trial against Michael Scott begun. In this trial, Springsteen's confession was read out, and again, the prosecution put forward no physical evidence that Michael Scott was at the murder scene. Still, a jury ended up convicting Michael Scott of capital murder in the death of Amy Ayers. Once these two are convicted, the charges against Maurice Pierce are actually dismissed and he's released from jail. A lot of people thought this might be case closed. However, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals actually threw out both Springsteen and Scott's convictions and sent the case back down to the trial court. Without getting too deep into the legalese, they were thrown out due to something called the Confrontation Clause. You've probably heard before that you have the right to confront your accusers and confront and cross-examine witnesses against you. In both trials, the confessions of the other were read out in court. However, neither one of those people were made available as witnesses to the defense. Thus, these confessions came in and the defense had no way to cross-examine or discredit the confessions of the other person. Now, why was this so powerful? It's because the two confessions were nearly identical. And so when the jury sat back and reviewed the two confessions, they were able to convict based on how similar the two were. However, the Court of Appeals believed that because the defense wasn't allowed to cross-examine the person who actually made the confession, that the defendant's right to confrontation were ignored, and thus they overturned the conviction. The DA in Travis County prepared for 2 more trials for each defendant. Then, suddenly, in April 2008, a defense lawyer came forward and disclosed in a court document that previously undiscovered DNA that did not come from either Scott or Springsteen had been taken from one of the victims. The DA was gearing up for trial in July of 2008, but given this new DNA evidence, they were not ready to move forward. So the 2 defendants were momentarily released while the DA decided how they were going to proceed. The state would then go on to dismiss all charges against these 2 defendants in light of this DNA evidence. This is probably the part where you're thinking, well, great, they got DNA evidence. We're definitely going to find who did this soon. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. With the amount of DNA that was collected, up until recently, technology could only rule out suspects. It wasn't enough to actually identify and incriminate specific suspects. But don't worry, the case has recently got a shot in the arm. In 2021, the House Judiciary Committee passed legislation that gave families of cold case victims an opportunity to petition the federal government to re-examine cases older than 3 years. This is important because the FBI has been holding on to that DNA and hasn't given other entities the opportunity to test it. So in 2022, it was actually announced that advanced DNA technology was bringing the the investigators very close to being able to actually get an identity from the small amount they were able to recover from the scene. A few months after that, President Joe Biden signed the Homicide Victim Families' Rights Act. This was largely motivated by the yogurt shop murders. This would make it even easier for families of homicide victims to pursue finding old information and retesting DNA, as well as allowing private entities to go through old evidence and see what they can find. However, unless something drastic happens, it looks like none of these 4 boys actually committed the murders, or they did it with a 5th person who supplied the DNA. Before we wrap up with the boys, I do have to mention that in December of 2010, an Austin police officer named Frank Wilson actually conducted a traffic stop on Maurice Pierce, whose case had been dismissed years before Scott's and Springsteen's. There was a brief chase on foot before Pierce actually started struggling with the police officer. He actually removed a knife from his belt and stabbed the police officer in the neck. The officer survived his injuries, but he pulled out his gun and shot and killed Pierce. People close to Pierce have said that the trauma of going through the trial, being arrested, and being in prison for so many years left Pierce extremely skittish, wary of his surroundings. So with that in mind, let's talk about the suspects that the true crime community and myself have looked into, as well as some interesting theories that have popped up around the case. The first of the main suspects you see talked about is Kenneth McDuff, who was a prolific serial killer at the time and was on a killing rampage during the time of these yogurt shop murders. He never acted alone and almost always used an accomplice when he would commit these murders, and these accomplices would usually be the ones who would rat him out in the end. So there was a big push once he was arrested to confirm whether or not he committed these murders. He was ruled out by investigators pretty quickly. McDuff ended up being executed for his crimes in 1998. Many in the true crime community still believe that McDuff had a chance to do it. If you look through some forums, you'll see a lot of theories, especially that he was active in Central Texas at the time, and that his method of killing was so brutal that it matched up with what we saw in this case. Still, we're talking about years after the investigation began, and the police were looking for any way to close this case. So the idea that they just passed up on an opportunity to pawn this off on a prolific serial killer at the time and just get some easy convictions makes it seem like they would have followed that thread a little bit more if they really thought he had something to do with it. There's also a mystery donor that people talk about a lot who had submitted his DNA for testing, and the FBI used the Y chromosome data that they had from the leftover DNA to actually match him to the crime. However, this doesn't mean that he specifically committed the crime. It just means that he shares similar DNA to the person who did commit the crime. The problem is this fragment of DNA could actually belong to thousands of different people. They only have a fragment, so it's like we talked about earlier. They have no way to confirm using just the fragment yet that a person was there. They can only tell what type of person was there based on this small fragment. However, if you look at someone else's DNA and it doesn't contain this fragment, it is enough to rule those people out. That's why they could rule out the 4 boys, but they could not rule out this donor, even though it's very unlikely that he was the one who committed the crimes. The FBI has come out and refused to identify this donor just to protect his anonymity, and I have to agree that that does make sense. There's some other pieces of witness testimony and some small evidence fragments that on their own don't seem like too much, but are pretty interesting to talk about. There is a theory that is pretty prevalent online that the girls were actually harboring someone inside the yogurt shop. There was a small crawl space in the yogurt shop where several witnesses and customers had frequently complained about a scratching, biting, and noises coming from the crawl space. Now, of course, that could be a ton of different animals, but there was one individual that many customers and witnesses had seen come into the shop, use the bathroom many times, and the girls would usually defend him or shrug him off and say that he was harmless or that they were aware of him and what he was doing. The problem with this is there's nothing indicating that this was the same person every single time. And while the homelessness problem in the early 90s is not the same in Austin as it is today, it was still an area with a lot of starving artists who were homeless, and there's no way of knowing if this was the same person every time or different people. For what it's worth, after looking through a lot of forum posts on the crawl space theories, it seems to be a lot of hearsay of people saying that they had heard from friends or friends of friends that they were definitely keeping people in the crawl space. While there are some mentions of there being a crawl space and people reporting noises coming from the crawl space in the days and weeks before the killings, I couldn't find anything where the investigators seemed to take it very seriously. So it's not that I'm choosing to not take it seriously, but based on the amount of reliable information available, I just don't think I can consider it a viable issue at the time. Now, a more intriguing angle is that supposedly the shop owners had been receiving numerous threats in the weeks leading up to the killings. This has led a lot of online commenters to think that there was actually some cartel activity that involved the owners of the yogurt shop, and that was meant to just target one of the owners, and that things went wrong when all 4 girls were in the shop after hours, and it turned into the bloodbath that it did. Still, almost all the evidence surrounding this seems to exclusively be based around the fact that the owner had been receiving threats in the weeks prior to the killings. Some people have also speculated that it was angry ex-boyfriends. There's no real evidence to back that up, especially any that would actually incriminate someone. And of course, a lot of people do speculate that just because the DNA didn't belong to one of the boys or one of these other suspects like McDuff, someone else with them wouldn't have left their DNA behind. Just because the DNA didn't belong to any of them doesn't mean that none of them were there. And that's certainly a good point. However, I think most people are focused on the two individuals who were at the last table as the yogurt shop closed. One thing that gets repeated a lot, and one thing that you see, is this image of all the tables actually put up with chairs on top of them except for that last table, as that's what it looked like when the firefighters arrived. What this suggests is that this was the last table and it hadn't been cleaned yet when the girls locked up and then were subsequently attacked by the two who were sitting there. And that if the two had left and then someone else had come in, they would have put a chair and flipped over that table. However, based on the pictures, the first thing I noticed is that this is a booth, and while the other booths do have a chair stacked over it, there's no chair for this booth. On top of that, all of the witnesses say one of the men was sitting in the booth while the other was standing next to it most of the time. So that doesn't sound like there was a chair next to the booth, so there was nothing to flip over. That being said, I do think these two people are likely the two people who committed the crime. Still, it's just an interesting little detail. Also, as with many true crime cases, there are a lot of people pointing fingers at the police department, especially because they had recently been raided by the FBI, and one of their officers was actually let go because of his interrogation tactics in eliciting false confessions. I saw a few people throw around online that they believe that there were several people in Austin who knew who committed the yogurt shop murders. They were too scared to come forward in fear of the Austin Police Department retaliating. This, of course, was not helped by the killing of Maurice Pierce in 2010, which a lot of people think was Maurice being silenced by the police for attempting to blow the lid off the whole case. In my research, I actually was able to talk to one of the jurors on the Michael Scott case. After a brief back and forth, they said they didn't want their identity shared or even their gender shared. They did make it clear to me that they were jurors on the case. I talked to them a little bit, but they made it clear that the case had been very traumatizing to them, especially what they did have to see. One thing they did sit through was the entire 20-hour interrogation of Michael Scott. I asked if there was one sudden moment that convinced them that Michael Scott was guilty. The juror said that there really wasn't, that it was just a slow buildup of many different inconsistencies. Now, I have to imagine inconsistencies with the defense's theory of events versus the prosecution's and what little they could prove. The really crazy thing is that the juror had actually not followed anything about the trial and moved out of Austin very soon after the trial. So they had only extremely recently found out via a true crime thread on Reddit that the case was overturned back in 2009. They were completely shocked to learn that DNA had cleared them, and they didn't offer really any comment about that, other than that they were completely shocked and were positive that he had been guilty. So what it looks like at this point is we're waiting on the DNA. This is going to be one of those cases that isn't solved until it suddenly is one day, when the right person goes in and submits their DNA. I actually went by the site of the yogurt shop today, which is a nail salon and spa. That building was actually merged with the building next to it. I didn't want to go inside as to bother the people working, but I did want to kind of take in the area, and I was able to find a photo or two from inside the business, so you can kind of see what it looks like now. The only thing I would really add here is that I think a lot of people rush to 4 suspects pretty quickly given the 4 boys, but these 2 guys really seem to be the main 2. Now, of course, we said earlier that one of them went to the back to use the bathroom. There was an exit door back there where he could have let more people in. So it's not like you can just rule out 4 people, but a lot of times people do seem to focus on there being 4 individuals. Unfortunately, this case was really hurt by the fact that all of the evidence was destroyed in fighting the fire. Who knows how much more we would have, maybe fingerprints or more DNA. One thing I do see a lot of people say is they do believe that the girls knew their killers, especially with how a lot of witnesses said they were acting towards the 2 people sitting at the front table. Now, it's also just as possible that they didn't really pay them any mind and just working for the end of their shift. As someone who lives in Austin, I find this case extremely disturbing. The more you read into the details of the injuries that I really tried to spare you from in this video, such a horrific crime just needs to be solved. It's so awful what happened to these girls, and I really do hope that this new advancement in technology can give us some answers. But with that, thank you so much for watching the video. As always, I really appreciate the time. If you're so inclined, I would love if you liked, subscribed, or checked out the Patreon. The Patreon actually has a free tier as well, and for the next few videos, we're going to be including anyone who signs up for the Patreon. Even if it's just a free tier, we'll be including them in the video. I've been really excited to bring you this true crime content. I'm a big believer in using no AI or AI narrators to go through this evidence, and I really hope my legal background can give you guys a little bit more insight than you would usually get from just a generic channel. But with that being said, I do plan to start uploading these videos every Friday night, so you guys have something to watch for the weekend. As always, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I've been Goodbye You Boudreaux. Have a great night.